Coming up, Indigenous players in the Super Bowl. The Forest Service advances nation-to-nation agreements. Plus, what can Indigenous congressional representatives do to bridge the partisan divide? I'm Mark Trahan. Join us for those interviews, plus the headlines from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We start in Washington, D.C., where after 3 years, COVID's public health emergency status is ending in the United States. President Joe Biden informed Congress last week that he will officially end the pandemic's emergency declaration in May. The move comes as Indigenous nations are just beginning to ease restrictions within their territories. In January, the Navajo Nation rescinded a mask mandate that's been in effect since the early days of the pandemic. After May, uninsured people will lose virtually all guaranteed access to COVID tests, vaccines, and treatments. Another important change is that Medicaid programs administered by states will require patients to be up to date with their financial information, or people could lose coverage. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention 2021 data, 26% of Native adults aged 18 to 64 do not have health insurance. COVID-19 is still the leading cause of death for Indigenous Americans. A federal agency has ordered a stop to the development of a mining project in Alaska. The Environmental Protection Agency has ended a controversial gold and copper mine to protect salmon populations. Supporters of the Pebble mine say it would improve the economy of the Bristol Bay region of Alaska. But many local tribes, fishermen, and conservation groups are worried about the impact of Bristol Bay watershed, which has the world's largest sockeye salmon fishery. The EPA cited the Clean Water Act and its authority to stop the project based on certain discharges of dredged or fill material, and will have a reason to cause environmental harm. Pebble Mine owners, Pebble Limited Partnership, plans to fight the order, stating the loss of economic opportunity will hurt local residents and tribal communities. In Brazil, illegal mining is being blamed for the growing Yanomami health crisis in the Amazon rainforest. Severe malnutrition, disease, particularly malaria, are destroying the indigenous communities in the country. On January 20th, the federal government declared a public health emergency. Overall, native health is in decline due to the mining in the area, which occupies fertile land, poisons rivers, and destroys water sources. Indigenous leaders say former President Jair Bolsonaro ignored letters pleading for help and that Native communities continue to live in fear.
We stayed 4 years without health assistance in the communities. 120 communities fighting for life. More than 20,000 gold miners in the Yanomami indigenous land with guns, intimidating communities. Communities that are living with fear.
According to data from Brazil's ministry, at least 570 Yanomami children died from untreated diseases during Bolsonaro's term. In Canada, Indigenous women are being empowered through free self-defense classes at the University of Winnipeg. The program began in 2018 as a reaction to the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples crisis. While the main demographic of the class is Indigenous women, any female identifying participant over the age of 12 is welcome. Organizers say one of the goals is to help women regain the confidence that violence has taken away from them. Anishinaabe citizen Jason Parenteau leads the class and teaches the basics of jiu-jitsu, a martial arts-based self-defense. Parenteau says this course is strictly defensive, and it teaches women how to escape dangerous situations. Indigenous women who've gone through the class say they now know how to protect themselves. Another Indigenous person is making history on Broadway. Playwright Larissa Fasthorse will soon see her name shining out front of the Helen Hayes Theater in New York City. The Thanksgiving play making its debut there on March 23rd. Fasthorse tells the story of a white teachers and actors who are trying to put on a Thanksgiving pageant during Native American Heritage Month. For the Broadway run, she revisited the 2015 script and made a few updates to reflect some of the changes in the world. And Princeton University is working in partnership with the theater to welcome more Native Americans into the audience. Ticket initiatives for Indigenous groups and elders and panels featuring contemporary Native artists will soon be part of the act. And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Phoenix is getting ready this week to host the Super Bowl. ICT will have reporters on the ground with pregame events. Who are the Indigenous players on Kansas City and Philadelphia? NDN Sports co-founder Brent Cahwee tells us more. Welcome back, Brent.
Hello, how are you, Mark?
I'm good. So I know the social media memes are taking off with the Eagles and the Chiefs set to face each other on Sunday. Well, let's start by talking about the Indigenous players on both sides.
Yeah, for sure. On the Kansas City side of the Super Bowl this year, we have James Winchester, who's in his 8th season now with the Kansas City Chiefs. He's returning back to the Super Bowl for the 2nd time with the Kansas City. Great player. He's proud of his heritage. We also have Creed Humphrey from the Citizen Band of Potawatomi. He was on the all-rookie team last year in the NFL as a starting center. And then this year, he is in his 2nd season, and he's doing really well. This will be his first Super Bowl appearance.
I think it's hard for people to gauge the scope of the Super Bowl. One, the size of the audience, but also what it does to a host city with events happening really all over the region. Native people are very much a part of that here in Phoenix with artists and all kinds of kind of ancillary events. Tell me more about that part of the story.
You know, the Super Bowl is the one of the most watched events in all of the world, honestly, you know, outside of the World Cup soccer. It's broadcast all over the world in 120 countries. There's literally, you know, a third of the world watching this Super Bowl. And it starts today, honestly, as the teams travel to the Arizona to compete. And also it's a media frenzy as well, as media from all over the world come and attend. There'll be activities going on every day at the stadium starting today with media events and showcase events and stuff like that. So it's a really huge undergoing, and it takes, you know, years and years of planning to have it in a city like that. So, but there's things, like you said, with the arts that go on. There's, you know, all kinds of things that just kind of take place all week there in Arizona.
One of the truisms of having Kansas City in this particular Super Bowl is that it'll be another opportunity to have the mascot debate play out. And I know a lot of folks are planning to come to Phoenix just for that. Maybe tell us that story.
Yeah, definitely. I think that issue is ongoing and unresolved. And, you know, just as many fans that are traveling there to participate in all the Super Bowl events, there's also people bringing awareness to a lot of things associated with the mascot, as well as other issues that the NFL faces, that they face every year.
I'm going to turn back to the broader Indian country story beyond the Super Bowl and talk about basketball. It's taking center court across Resball, of course, renovations across the country. Tell us about some of the players that you're watching.
Yeah, you know, this is the best time of the year. You got the upcoming championships coming up. You got the tournaments coming up, and it's beginning the wrap up of the basketball season. A couple of players I wanted to talk about real quick were some phenomenal freshmen at the collegiate level. We have Lene Billy, who's from the Navajo Nation. She plays at the Fort Lewis College, and she's the leading scorer on her team. She's averaging like 17 points a game. She's also the number 2 ranked scoring player in the Rocky Mountain Athletic Conferences as well, which is a Division II conference within the NCAA. So she's having a phenomenal year. Another phenomenal freshman is Shantashia John, who's a Mississippi Choctaw at a Belhaven University, which is a Division II university. Not only is she leading scorer on her team, she's also leading the conference in scorer as well. What's great about this is typically you have a lot of players who have a great start to their freshman year, but they kind of die out because they're not used to the play and the length of the season. But these two are still at the top of the game this late into the season.
What other sports are you following, Brent?
Well, like I said, now we're starting to wrap up the conference season for high school athletes. We have the Rock Point, Arizona Lady Cougars, who won their Class 1A division. They're out of Arizona, obviously. And then we also have Fort Thomas Apache, Lady Apaches and Apaches as well, who both won their divisional as well, and they'll be heading off to state. So like I said, a great time of year. Enjoy this part where I get to go and travel and watch tournaments and stuff like that. So we're just looking forward to a lot of our native teams and players doing really well.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll be right back. The Forest Service wants to strengthen relationships with federally recognized tribes. Under the Department of Agriculture, it controls the national forests and grasslands. Forest Chief Randy Moore talked with ICT Shirley Sneve about plans for tribal consultations and learning traditional best practices. Let's take a look.
There's a renewed interest in trying to work with the tribes. You know, we've put together a tribal action plan. We've also had personal visits, myself and the Undersecretary, out to Indian country up in the North and South Dakota. We have a couple of other meetings scheduled for this week. So we're really trying to renew and even escalate, if you will, that level of interest in tribal issues and concerns. I think what you'll see is us enter into a lot more agreements like the shared stewardship agreements, where we are sharing leadership and co-managing in some cases. And so I think you'll see a lot of those things taking place now. As a matter of fact, we have about 11 shared stewardship agreements now. We have another 60 or so that's in the works. I think 40 or so that's in the works that we're trying to work through now. And what that demonstrates is a real commitment that this administration has toward working with the tribes. Ultimately, you know, we have to do a better job of, first of all, being educated about what some of the tribal interests are. And, you know, we can talk about these types of things, but it's different when you go and you spend a week with the tribes riding around in the truck, listening to the concerns and the interests. And the Undersecretary Wilkes and I did just that a couple months back, and it gave us a level of understanding that we would not have gotten by sitting at this desk here in Washington, D.C., or just attending meetings here and there. It's really going out on the ground and really understanding ultimately what is it that many of the tribes want. And they want their land back. While I cannot give them the land back, we can do everything we can within our power to work with the tribes to make sure that we are an inclusive organization, making sure that we are including the tribes in not only how we manage these lands, but how should we be managing these lands? You know, looking at the traditional tribal practices, for example. When you look at the 10-year strategy on wildfire reduction, you know, it's really how do we restore prescribed fire back to the landscape in these fire adapted ecosystems that the tribes was doing great with many years before this country became known as America. And so I do think there are lessons learned from traditional tribal practices. And when you integrate that with the science, I'm just excited about what the possibilities are going forward. If you take the western part of the U.S. and if you look at the conditions that the landscapes are in now, we want to put fire back on the landscape, but we know that we also have to remove some of the thick vegetation that's on the landscapes now. And so while we're developing this plan, what better way than to sit down with the tribes now to say, what is it that we're trying to achieve and how do we maintain it once we achieve it? And this is where I think the tribes could have a monumental role in what happens on these lands. that they care so much about, as well as us caring about them too. And so, Shirley, I think what you'll see is just a genuineness for including the tribes in how we manage these lands. I think what you'll see is a genuineness of us being inclusive as we go about. Now, I understand too, we're doing a lot. In this past year and a half, we've been doing a lot, but we also have a lot more to do. We have a lot more to understand, and we don't understand it yet. And it's one thing for me as the chief to say that this is what we're intending to do. It's another thing when you look at the organization all the way down to the ground level, making sure that we all have the same level of understanding, making sure that we all have that same level of commitment to make a difference in what we're doing out there, what our intents are. We're looking at some new opportunities up on the grasslands in the Dakotas now, and particularly with the Lakotas. And so I think you'll see a lot of those kinds of agreements coming to fruition this year. It's interesting for me, and that's why I said, it's one thing to even study about it and to sit in meetings and learn about it, but it's totally different going out on the ground, riding over that ground with some of the tribes who has a tradition and has a history of those lands. For me, it was really educational to look at the beginnings of those lands being reservations, only to be not reservations, only to be turned into grasslands, federal grasslands. And so I think that we have an obligation and a responsibility, and we also have the opportunity to share in how those grasslands are being managed. And so we're looking at trying to figure out how can we move forward in a more inclusive manner that are engaging with the tribes and including the tribes on how we might co-manage some of these same lands. It's one thing for me to say something, but I would encourage you to monitor the actions that we take going forward over the next couple of years. Our intentions are good, but if there's no fruition to the intentions, then the intentions are worthless. And so I just will say, stand by and be ready to engage with us, help us to learn the traditional values and methods that have meant so much to you and many other tribes through the years.
That was Forest Service Chief Randy Moore. We'll be right back. Partisanship seems to be the wave of the future in the nation's capital, with Republicans controlling the House and the Democrats hanging on by a thread of power in the Senate. What does the future hold for Americans? The CEO and principal of 7 Star Holdings joins us today. As former Chief of Staff for Mark Wayne Mullen, he's a Cherokee citizen from Oklahoma. Welcome, Mike.
Mark, good to see you again.
Well, you joined us on November 8th for ICT's election coverage, and I want to think, looking back at that night, what has surprised you then and since?
Well, let me say one quick comment about your last guest. Love Brent, love the work he's doing in Indian country. Obviously, sports is something that is a very nonpartisan issue, though we do love our teams. But I love the work and what he's bringing to Indian country and what he's showing off for our athletes. Now back to your question about November. I think many of us went into election night for the general election last year thinking that there's going to be a red wave. And obviously that red wave did not come. There are a number of issues, and there's been a lot of thinking in the Republican circles about why exactly that happened. There's been a lot of finger pointing. There's been a lot of blame. And you can see that both in some of the response to Donald Trump's decision to announce that he is running for president again. You can see it in the speaker's election, which went on for 15 votes, which is historic. And then you can see it again in the election that was held last week in the RNC chair's position with Ronna McDaniel winning. There was a lot of pushback from the grassroots, but the party is still trying to determine for itself why the red wave did not come in November. So I think the biggest lesson for me is we're doing something wrong. We're not messaging correctly as we should be. I think a lot of times these partisan attacks, I think the American people get very tired of that, and that's true on both sides. There was a recent poll that came out last week that said that over 50% of Americans do not want to see Donald Trump elected again, but over 60% don't want to see Joe Biden elected again. That was the only consensus. They didn't really want either one. So if it's the two of them in 2024, Americans going to have to hold their nose and vote for one or the other. I think that's unfortunate. I think we can do better. I think there's a lot of people out there who haven't spent their time in Washington that have great ideas that they can bring to the forefront instead of getting into all this partisan bickering. So that's kind of my review from November, Mark.
Okay, well, and already we're seeing a variety of Republican candidates either tiptoe into the water or actually in. I was thinking about former Governor Nikki Haley jumping into the race.
She is, and she's a great candidate. Do I think she can pull it off in a primary? I'm not 100% sure yet. She's certainly going to have a lot of respect from voters and from our delegates. She has a lot of respect of mine. You also see Ron DeSantis, who hasn't officially announced yet, but he's the big talker right now. You've got Governor Abbott out of Texas who's talking about it, and there's a few others that are still talking about it. I think there's some folks who are talking about Governor Kristi Noem as well. So we do have a couple of strong female candidates who could be potential runners next year. I will say specifically from a Republican standpoint, I hope that we don't have too crowded a field in the Republican primary and that we kind of work these things out before we get into the voting season.
The Democrats recently changed their voting state going first. Do you think the Republicans need to look at that as well, or are you pretty well set with Iowa and New Hampshire?
Well, I think that we've seen over the last few election cycles that Iowa and New Hampshire have not necessarily been, the oracle we'd hope they would be in telling us who's going to be the winner and who's not. Their track record is starting to change, and I think that's part of the information age. People can go different places to get their information. The internet's becoming much more important in these elections. So these caucus style elections and these early on elections aren't necessarily having the same effect or influence on voters in later primaries that they have in the past. And I think that has a lot to do with the information age. It also shows and highlights a very difficult issue in the DNC and RNC both, and that the RNC and DNC both have their own rules and how they want to conduct these elections, while at the same time the states, who are the sovereign power, actually have their own laws in place. So you see the conflict between New Hampshire and Georgia and the DNC's rules. And then if the RNC were to do something similar, you would also see conflicts there. The conflict also comes up when you start talking about delegates, not necessarily the superdelegate type, which both parties have, but delegates who are assigned to a specific candidate. Some states have laws requiring delegates to vote as they're supposed to at a convention, but the question has always been, how does a state enforce that if the convention is in another state? So there are some challenges between the national party organizations and the states and the laws. So I think this change in the primary calendar really highlights that there are challenges.
I want to take you back to Congress real quick. There's some really tough issues, such as the debt limit coming up. Where is the common ground that we should be looking for? I think the challenge that we have, especially when it comes to spending and appropriating, is you're looking at almost a $5 trillion government now. And it's actually larger if you consider all the extra stuff that we've did through the COVID period. But that is very hard for the members of Congress to really take the time and dig into the issues. So I am an Army veteran. I went to West Point. I do believe in a strong defense, but I also understand that there's plenty of waste, fraud, and abuse inside the defense budget. The challenge comes in taking the time for each member of Congress or for the committees to really comb through the issues that you see in a $900 billion budget like we see with the Department of Defense. So I think there are places where we can find cuts where we know that they're wasteful. You also have the problem with, what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, where we just saw the Navy saying they didn't need ships, and Congress said we needed them because of the jobs. We need to get serious about where we're spending our money and why. There's a lot of issues on the table. I know that there's a push now to overturn the
the Inflation Reduction Act. And the talking point is, of course, that is an attack on Medicare, which is not true. That portion of the bill is only part of it. The rest of it is, in fact, has very little to do with inflation reduction. It has a lot to do with energy policy. So there are places where we need to look to work together. And sometimes these big bills make it harder than it should be. We get this partisanship where it's an all or nothing vote. Either you vote for everything, including quite a bit of the stuff you don't like, or you don't vote for things you do like. So there are a lot of Republicans who actually agree with the Medicare prescription package because it does allow cost savings, because Medicare can now go out and negotiate for better prices, right, and on prescription drugs, which is a very fiscally conservative and sound proposition.
Mike Stopp, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.